In the scorching west of 1884, a young woman stepped down from a dusty stagecoach. She had only an old suitcase in her hand, and her eyes were filled with fear. She was a mail-order bride, newly arrived in Red Hollow, a place where no one knew her. No one was waiting for her, except for a tall, rough man with a long scar on his cheek. He walked over, his eyes half kind, half tired, and said a sentence that made the whole town stop. "Darlin, I don't bite unless you ask." That half-joking, half-serious remark, to the listener, it was a flirtation, but to her it was a threat. An awkward start to the journey of two lonely souls, one running away from the past, the other trying to regain trust. But if it were you, standing in the middle of a strange land, with nothing but a fragile hope in your hands, would you have the courage to believe again in that barren place? Can love sprout from fear, from things you have not yet understood today? Frontier Hearts invites you to step into that story where people who thought they had lost themselves find each other amid the red dust, wild winds, and kindness that still remains on the border. If you love stories about tender love in the wilderness, please like, share, and subscribe to Frontier Hearts to listen to stories that make your heart flutter in that ancient land. That afternoon, the sun burned across the Sandorian Valley. Red dust swirled from the dirt road, clinging to clothes, hair, and every breath. An old horse-drawn carriage stopped in front of the town's only tavern. The crunch of its wheels on gravel sounded like the sigh of someone who had gone too far. The woman in the car gently pushed the door open and got out. Mary Ellen Burke, 28, wore a worn brown linen dress with a buttoned collar. She held the wooden suitcase tightly, as if it contained the rest of her life. The sun beat down on her pale face, sweat rolling down her temples. Across the street, a few men sat on the steps of the pub, looking up at her with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. "Mail-order bride," someone whispered, a smirk on their lips. Mary bowed her head, her heart pounding. Each step on dry ground sounded like the scorn of the entire town. She had never been to the West, nor could she believe that the wind could be so dry and stinging. Amid the dust, a man emerged from the stables behind the saloon. Jonas McGraw, the man she'd been promised in letters. He was tall, heavy-footed, his shoulders weathered by the sun. An old, faded scar marked half his left cheek, a mark of a time not easy to speak of, under the brim of his cowboy hat. His eyes regarded her for a moment, deep and cautious, as if assessing whether she was real or a mirage in the dust. Mary stood still, not daring to move forward. She had written so many letters to this man, whom she had never met, but now, facing him, the greetings stuck in her throat. Jonas took off his gloves and stepped closer. He stopped a few feet away from her, a slow smile tugging at one corner of his lips. "Darlin, I don't bite unless you ask," he said, his voice hoarse and low like wood scraping against a fire. Mary was startled. Her lip trembled, her eyes widened, her whole body tensed. Jonas's smile vanished. He took a deep breath, then spoke softly, embarrassed as if he hated the way it came out of his mouth. "Sorry, bad joke. I'm Jonas McGraw." She didn't answer. She just tightened her grip on the suitcase, clinging to the only thing that was solid in her life. Jonas scratched his head, then bent down and gently took the suitcase from her hand. The action, rough as it seemed, surprised Mary. He lifted it gently, as if afraid of breaking something fragile. "My farm is about 3 miles away," he said. My wagon is behind the stables. If you are ready." Mary nodded slightly and followed him. The distance between them, 3 steps, remained the same all the way to the car. 3 steps of hesitation, 3 steps of fear, 3 steps of an unknown beginning. In the distance, scattered rows of willows stood dry but proud in the wind. The landscape was unfamiliar, but somewhere Mary sensed something familiar perhaps, a loneliness she had brought with her from the far east. Jonas coughed softly, his voice echoing in the open air. "I know it's not easy, especially in a strange place like this, but you don't have to be afraid of me." Mary looked out the car window, not answering. The wind blew in, carrying the smell of burnt grass. She thought of the letters he had written, brief, matter-of-fact, sometimes clumsy, but sincere. In them, he had talked about cows, about the unfinished roof, and someone to make coffee with in the morning. At the time, she had thought it the simplest thing in the world. Now, it seemed as distant as a dream. By the time they arrived, the sun had set. The last of the sunset burned behind the hills, dyeing the land a deep copper color. She thought of the letters he had written, brief, matter-of-fact, sometimes clumsy, but sincere. In them, he had talked about cows, about the unfinished roof, and someone to make coffee with in the morning. At the time, she had thought it the simplest thing in the world. Now, it seemed as distant as a dream. She looked at him, not sure whether to be grateful or suspicious. He didn't touch her, didn't ask, just spoke and left the room, leaving a long silence. Outside, the wind howled through the cracks in the door, carrying with it the cold of the desert night. Mary sat on the bed, her hand clutching the inkwell, the only thing she had brought from her father's house. It was getting dark. She heard his footsteps in the kitchen. Then silence. A moment later, the hinges creaked slightly. The door opened slightly, and his hand reached in, placing the woolen blanket and the cup of warm water. No word. The door closed again. Mary sat silently, tears falling in the darkness. She opened the small diary and wrote in shaky handwriting, "He didn't touch me. He just didn't want me to be cold." Then she closed the book and placed it on her pillow. The wind outside still whistled through the roof tiles, but in her heart there was a very faint warmth, a warmth so fragile but so real that she was afraid she would lose it if she breathed too hard. That night, Mary slept fitfully. In her dream, she saw herself standing in a wide meadow, the moonlight shining on Jonas's shoulders, and there, in the silence, there was something unsaid, but it made her believe that there might be another day to start over. The next morning, as the first light of dawn crept through the wooden windows, Mary knew that this little house, strange as it was, might be the first place in her life where she would be allowed to rest without fear. The morning wind blew through the porch, carrying the smell of smoke and damp grass. The first rays of light shone through the thin curtains, glinting on the old suitcase in the corner of the room. Mary opened her eyes and sat up, her hands still clutching the small diary, a habit of self-defense. The space was so quiet that she could hear her heart beating, mingling with the distant crowing of roosters on the hillside. Outside, there was the sound of a man's footsteps on the wooden floor. Jonas was awake. The kitchen door opened, and there was the crackle of wood and the faint smell of coffee. The smell reminded her of old mornings in Boston, when her mother was still alive, the peaceful smell of days before fear could take shape. She washed her face slowly, fixed her hair, and went outside. Jonas was standing by the stove, holding a tin kettle, his back to her. The morning light fell on his shoulder, reflecting off the silver scar on his cheek. He said nothing, only nodded slightly at the sound of her footsteps. "Coffee on the table," he said, his voice as low as the night before. Mary sat down, her hands wrapped around the hot tin mug. She was not used to the silence between them, but she did not want to break it. The heat from the fireplace in the cabin felt both warm and unfamiliar. "You are up too early," she said, her voice low. "Cows don't wait for anyone," Jonas replied, taking a sip of coffee and setting the cup down. "You can rest a bit longer. I'm just doing some work around the farm." Mary nodded, looking down at his calloused hands. There were small cuts and sunburns on the skin, and the obvious truth these were the hands of someone accustomed to hardship. She wanted to say thank you, but her throat tightened. Instead, she whispered, "Your home is so peaceful." Jonas smiled a little, a smile as quiet as mist. "Yes, but it's lonely. At noon, when the sun was high in the sky." Jonas went out into the fields, leaving Mary alone. The house was silent except for the sound of the wind coming through the cracks in the door. She walked around, admiring the strange simplicity of things: the battered oil lamp, some old books on the shelf, a pair of tattered boots neatly placed by the door. On the wall was a small, faded photograph, a younger man in gray uniform, his gaze proud but weary. On the back was written in rough pencil, J.M., 1865. Mary recognized it. It was Jonas, many years ago, and perhaps the photograph was the only thing left from another life. She put the photo back, gently, as if afraid to awaken memories. In her mind, the question echoed, can someone who has been wounded so deeply love again? But then she shook her head, dismissing the thought. She didn't come here to love. She came because she had nowhere else to go. As the afternoon wore on, the wind changed, the sky was orange, and red dust drifted past the window. Jonas returned, his coat over his shoulders, his boots caked with dirt. He came in, gently laid his hat on the table, and looked at her for a moment. "Has anyone come by?" "No," she said. "It's just the wind." He chuckled. "Here, the wind comes before the people." The remark made her smile for the first time since leaving Boston. Jonas opened the closet and took out a folded woolen blanket. "It's cold in the valley at night. If you need more wood, don't hesitate to ask." Mary took it, her eyes meeting his, a look that wasn't judging, not pitying, just the simple kindness of someone who had known pain. "Thank you," she said softly. I don't know anyone who's been this gentle." Jonas hesitated for a moment, then said, "Gentleness doesn't cost anything, but sometimes it's something people forget to give." She didn't know what else to say. She just nodded, then retreated to her room. That night, the wind howled louder, the house creaked with each gust, like a living thing trembling in the open meadow. Mary sat on the bed, clutching the old inkwell, the only thing that reminded her of her past. Every little sound startled her. She had learned to be cautious since childhood doors locked, lights kept out, breathing softly. In the East, they called it the caution of a woman without a protector. Here, it was simply a habit of survival. Outside, footsteps slowed, her heart sank. The hinges creaked. The door opened a crack. Jonas stood there, another woolen blanket in his hand and a steaming glass of water. He didn't meet her eyes, just said softly, "I thought you might be cold." The old blanket was too thin. Then he set the things down on the table, turned and walked away. No questions, no steps closer. Mary watched as the door closed. The light in the hallway dimmed. She sat still, and the tears fell, quietly, warm and real. She opened her diary and wrote a short note in smudged ink. He didn't touch me. He just didn't want me to be cold. She read the words again, and a strange feeling rose in her heart, not quite trust, but not quite fear either. There was something about the way he lived, the way he remained silent, that made her feel safer than any promise. The night was fading. The wind had died down, leaving only the crackling of the wood in the kitchen. Mary lay on her side, looking through the small window. Silver moonlight fell on the wooden floor, bathing everything in a soft, breathing light. She remembered Boston, the brick houses, the hushed voices, the contemptuous looks of people. Then she looked around the small room, filled with the smell of wood, coffee, and the warmth of a stranger. Maybe, she thought, sometimes God doesn't give you what you pray for, but what you never believed you deserved, a place to be safe. As her eyes slowly closed, Jonas sat outside on the porch, his gun across his lap, his eyes on the horizon. He heard the wind and his own heartbeat in the darkness. He knew the woman in the room had been afraid all her life, and he himself had lived in silence for too long. Perhaps they were both learning to believe in goodness again, if only through each other's silent presence. The next morning, when Mary opened the door, she found a steaming cup of coffee on the table and Jonas outside on the porch, planting white daisies, the flowers her mother had loved, in the ground. Sometimes kindness doesn't come in words. Mary stood in the doorway, her hands trembling slightly from the morning dew. The first rays of sunlight cast a soft, honey-gold hue over her hair. She looked at the man outside, his shoulders damp with dew, his hands soiled with dirt, and for a moment her fear seemed to stop. Jonas knelt beside the bed of earth on the porch, his rough hands holding each branch of small white flowers. The white daisies were fragile and simple, but in the sunlight they were as bright as the eyes of a child who believed for the first time. He did not know that this flower was the last memory Mary had of her dead mother, the flower she still grew in the small window where the smell of baked goods mingled with the gentle sound of song every afternoon. She wanted to ask how he knew, but then she stopped. Maybe it was just a coincidence, or maybe it was something bigger, something Westerners call with the simple word grace. In the days that followed, they lived together in a strange silence. Jonas still went out to the fields every morning, working until the sun disappeared behind the Sandorian mountains, while Mary cleaned, cooked, and tended the little house as if it were the place she had lived all her life. Neither of them asked anything of the other. Between them, there was only the slow rhythm of life, filled with the sound of the windmill, the rhythmic clopping of horseshoes on the ground, and the smell of wood smoke every evening. In the mornings, coffee was always ready on the table. Jonas never asked how she had slept. She never asked where he had been. Yet, in a quiet way, they both learned to care without words. One afternoon, when the wind blew in from the prairie, Mary saw Jonas leading the horse back to the stable. He stopped and watched her folding laundry in the yard. The wind blew the hem of her dress, and in the twilight she looked like someone who had belonged here all along. He started to say something, then stopped. Instead, he walked over and pointed to a small patch of land next to the porch. "If you want, I can make a bed for vegetables or flowers. The soil here is dry, but with patience they will bloom." Mary smiled. I will try. My mother used to say, where there are flowers, there is peace. Jonas nodded, his eyes as gentle as the afternoon. Peace is rare in this part of the country, but who knows, you might bring it. That evening the wind blew through the wooden roof, making a rustling sound like the sigh of a meadow. Mary sat by the window, mending a worn curtain. Jonas was on the porch, scraping the plowshare. The oil lamp light cast a golden glow across his face, revealing an old scar on his left cheek, a long, faded wound. She stopped sewing and stared. There was something in his eyes that made her breath catch not exactly sadness, not exactly loneliness, but a weariness that went deep into her bones. She had seen that look in the mirror before, after long nights of running away, when she realized the world had no place for her. As Jonas stood up, ready to go to the stables, she said, "Mr. McGraw." He turned back. "Just call me Jonas." "Jonas," she repeated hesitantly. "Thank you for the flowers." He looked at her for a long moment, then said, his voice as soft as the wind, "I just thought the lot was too empty." But his eyes could not hide a faint joy, the joy of someone who had not done anything to make others smile for a long time. In the following days, Mary began to write again. She took out her little notebook, the place where she had poured out her fears, and instead of writing about the things that weighed heavily on her heart, she wrote about the little things this morning. There was the smell of coffee and wet grass. Jonas didn't say anything, but he left me some cornflakes. I thought, maybe I'm still worth caring about. Writing up to there. She paused slightly, then closed the notebook. Sometimes, new faith begins with such a seemingly meaningless detail. One afternoon, as she was hanging her blankets out to dry, a gust of wind blew the white handkerchief from her hands. It circled through the air and landed on the fence where Jonas was standing, hammer and nails. He picked it up, dusted it off, and handed it back to her. Mary blushed. "Thank you?" He just smiled, a smile that stretched and softened the scar on her cheek. "It's a beautiful handkerchief," he said. "It must be someone special." Mary said softly, "It was my mother's. I kept it to remember her voice." Jonas was silent. After a while, he said, "My mother used to sing too, but I forgot the melody." They stood side by side, saying nothing more, letting the wind carry away the unfinished story. As night fell, the sky opened up like a velvet curtain of stars. Mary looked out and saw Jonas lighting a fire near the stables. The firelight illuminated his face, reminding her of the soldier in the old photograph. She realized that the man had been through something terrible, and instead of being cruel, he had chosen to remain silent and kind. One morning, when she put down her coffee cup, Jonas had already left. On the chair, he had left a small burlap bag. Opening it, inside were some seeds and a note that read, "I think you should plant some flowers. The earth will be happier." She read it over and over again, tears streaming down her face without knowing why, perhaps because for the first time in years, she felt like she no longer had to struggle to survive. That afternoon, Mary went out into the garden. She knelt down in the small bed beside the porch, her hands touching the soil. The sun shone on her hair, the wind gently swayed her skirt. In that moment, she knew. The fear in her heart was slowly melting away, giving way to something softer, gentler faith. Behind. Jonas stood in the doorway, watching. He did not call, did not step forward, only smiled. He understood. If there was anything to be said, the earth would speak for them. One morning, before the sun had cleared the mist, Jonas returned with his shirt torn and blood streaming down his arm. Mary ran out, her little hand trembling. For the first time, she saw clearly the real wound of the man she had called with gratitude. The morning mist drifted across the fields, thin as a breath. Jonas's horse panted, its legs caked with mud and ash. He fell from the saddle as he reached the porch, clutching the torn hem of his shirt. Dark blood soaked through the fabric and ran down his sleeve. Mary didn't have time to think. She rushed out, her bare feet pounding the wet ground, and pulled him inside. "Sit down," she said softly, but her voice was shaking. Jonas frowned slightly. "It's just a scratch." "No," she interrupted. "Sit down." He looked at her for the first time. There was no fear in her eyes, but a gentle command. Jonas sat down on the wooden chair by the window, the dim light falling on his shoulder, where the torn fabric revealed a patch of burned, deeply scratched skin. Mary brought the basin of water, the towel, and the bottle of antiseptic. She set them all on the table and sat down beside him, saying nothing. Her hands were small and white, trembling as they touched his skin. She cleaned the wound with warm water, each movement slow and careful. Every time the towel touched the cut, Jonas squeezed his hand, but did not flinch. He just looked out the window and where the mist was clearing, letting the pain seep into his bones. "What is this about you?" Her voice was as small as the wind. Jonas was silent for a long time. Finally, he said softly, his voice low and hoarse like the sound of fire. "A calf got lost in the woods. I chased it, but there were old ruins of war." Mary looked up. "The war." He nodded. "During the war, they told me to burn a church. There were people inside, women, children. I refused." She stopped. The water in the basin stopped, reflecting the flickering light, so they beat me, left me in the field. Jonas spoke slowly, each word heavy as stone. He bowed his head, his broad shoulders shaking slightly. "I survived. But from then on, I no longer believed in anything called victory." Mary looked at him, an indescribable feeling rising in her heart. She had thought that scar was just a mark of blind violence. Now she understood. It was a mark of kindness, a wound not to hide, but to remind him that, despite the beatings, he still chose not to do evil. She took a clean cotton ball and gently dabbed the medicine on his shoulder. The pungent smell of the medicinal wine filled the air. Jonas remained silent, not because of the pain, but because he feared she would see him as weak. Mary said softly, "You did the right thing." Jonas smiled tiredly. "The right thing is often unnecessary, but it makes you different," she replied, her hand still gently bandaging the wound. "You are not like any other man I have ever met." He looked up, his eyes wavering. "You've met many types of men." Mary smiled faintly, a sad, tired smile. "Just one type, the type that makes me run." They were silent. Outside, the sun was beginning to break through the mist, shining through the window. The light caught the newly wrapped bandage around Jonas's shoulder, making it glow like a mark of redemption. That afternoon, Jonas went out to the fields as usual. His arm hurt, but he didn't let her see. As Mary hung the clothes out to dry, she stopped to look at the old scar that ran down his cheek in the sun. It no longer frightened her. On the contrary, it comforted her as if it were proof that he had survived the worst and still chosen to be kind. When he returned home that evening, she had made hot soup. He wanted to say no, but when she placed the bowl in front of him, He just nodded his thanks. They ate in silence. Only the sound of the spoon lightly touching the bowl and the wind rustling outside the porch could be heard. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, when the meal was almost over. Jonas looked into the fire. "Yes, but if I had to choose again, I still wouldn't, because of conscience, because I still want to believe that there are things worth keeping, even when others throw them away." That sentence made Mary feel warm in her chest. She said nothing, just quietly wrote in her diary that night, "I have seen your real wound, not in your flesh, but in your heart. A man who took a beating instead of killing. Perhaps God still leaves people like you to prove that goodness is not dead." Night fell. Jonas sat on the porch, smoking his pipe. The moonlight filtered through the willows, reflecting on his white shoulders. Mary looked at him through the window, her heart light but confused. She wanted to thank him, but she was afraid that the words would break the fragile silence between them. She just gently closed the curtains, letting the remaining moonlight fall on the table, where there was a notebook and a line of newly written words, not yet dry. In the darkness, Jonas raised his head, listening to the wind through the eaves, and for a moment he thought he heard a woman singing far away, a voice as soft as a breath, lost in the night. He knew it was no dream, just the sound of something healing. The next day, as the sun rose, Mary stepped out onto the porch. Jonas had been up early, closing the east fence. She called out, "Is your shoulder okay?" He turned and smiled. "It's fine. It's not as bad as it was years ago." She understood. He wasn't talking about the flesh wound. She just nodded and said softly, "I'm glad you're still here." Jonas bent down to continue his work, the smile still on his lips. Somewhere, in the quiet valley of Red Hollow, two souls had begun to touch not with hands, but with understanding. But sometimes, just as the wound is healing, the past comes back like a poisonous wind. One afternoon, as Mary was going to the Red Hollow market for the first time, she heard a familiar voice behind her, a voice she prayed she would never hear again. That morning, the Sandorian Valley was sunny. Mary, carrying a basket of linen, walked down the dirt road toward town. She wore a simple green dress Jonas had given her from leftover fabric a little too big, but light and airy. It was the first time she had left the farm alone since arriving in Red Hollow. The bustling atmosphere of the market was a far cry from the quiet of her home. The cries of hawkers, the clatter of carts, the cheerful chatter of voices, and the smell of fresh baked goods from Mrs. Crane's shop wafted through the air. She stopped at the general store, Miller's General Store, to buy some sugar and salt. "Old Mr." Miller bowed and asked her questions in a gentle voice that made her feel less nervous. Mary was choosing tea when a voice behind her pulled her from her thoughts. "Well, if it ain't little Mary Burke." The voice was hoarse, drawn out, mixed with a sinister smile. She stood still. Her body was cold, as if someone had just poured ice water down her back. She turned. It was Silas Grady, a thin man with deep, hollow eyes and lips as thin as a knife. When her Boston house had burned in the night, he had watched from across the street, smiling, while her parents screamed inside. "Silas." Her voice was barely a breath. He moved closer, the smell of cheap liquor and acrid tobacco surrounding him. "I heard you fled west," he said, his voice laced with a cruel joke. "But you know, ash never leaves your skirts." The words fell like a knife. Mary dropped her teacup, The sound of shattering china echoed throughout the shop. All she wanted to do was run. "Mr. Miller called after her, but she didn't hear. She ran out of the store, her shoes in the red dust, her heart pounding. The town blurred before her eyes. The wind whipped against her face, ripping away the calm she had maintained. The road to the farm was long. She did not stop, though her lungs burned. When she reached it, she collapsed on the porch, gasping for breath, tears mingling with the dust. Jonas was unloading hay bags near the stables. He saw her, threw down the bags, and ran toward her. What happened? She just shook her head, unable to speak. Her throat was tight. Jonas put a hand on her shoulder, but she instinctively recoiled, her eyes panicked. He knew this was not a wound that could be healed with words. He was silent, just said softly, "Okay, no need to say anything." Then he turned away. Jonas didn't eat dinner that night. He just left a tray of soup and bread on the kitchen table, then took it and set it in front of Mary's door. He didn't knock, didn't say anything, just left it there and went back to the porch. Outside, the night wind blew hard from the step, carrying a chill. Jonas sat on the old chair, the gun across his lap, his eyes fixed on the dim road leading to town. That night, he did not sleep. Each time the distant barking of a dog echoed, he tightened his grip on the stock of the gun. Inside, Mary sat by the bed, her hands shaking as she held the wooden spoon from the tray. She couldn't eat, but the steam rising from the soup brought tears to her eyes. No one had ever done anything so kind for her, a woman who had only known how to run away. She stood up and gently drew back the curtains. Through the crack in the door, she saw Jonas still sitting there, his back straight, his eyes staring into the darkness, silent and steady as a pillar in a strong wind. For a moment, she felt something she had never known: protection. She wrote in her diary, "I thought I was just dust, something the wind could blow away at any moment. But tonight, someone is sitting on the porch, letting the wind blow on my shoulder instead of me. Maybe not everyone wants me to disappear." Mary woke late the next morning. Jonas was gone. The mark of his unfinished coffee cup lay on the kitchen table, a faint mist of steam on the rim. She touched it. It was still warm. Outside the door, his footsteps were clearly etched into the dirt, long, heavy steps toward the stables. She stood watching, her heart aching. In the afternoon, when he returned, she took the bowl of water to the well to wash. He stopped beside her, saying nothing. They just stood there, the two of them, two long shadows on the ground, silent. "Someone scares you?" Jonas asked after a while. She hesitated. "It's just the past." "The past can't ride," he replied, his voice low. "It can only come if you stop." Mary looked up at him. For the first time, she saw in his eyes not just sadness, but something warmer, a simple belief that, no matter how cruel life is, one can still start again. Late afternoon. The wind carried the scent of earth after rain. Mary went out onto the porch and saw that the tray of soup from yesterday had been washed and placed neatly on the table. On the tray was a newly bloomed white daisy, pure white, its petals still covered with dew. She picked it up and smiled slightly. Her hand, for the first time in years, was no longer shaking. That night, the sky was clear and full of stars. Jonas sat on the porch again, but this time Mary's window was open. The light from inside spilled out, mingling with the moonlight. No one spoke. There was only silence, a silence no longer of fear, but of dawning trust. The next day, when Mary went into town with Mrs. Crane, she saw Jonas bending over to mend a fence for the widow Edith Moore, unasked and unpaid. He simply said, "She has no one else." Mary realized then true kindness does not need to be seen. The town of Red Hollow was sunny that afternoon. The western sun not only shone, it penetrated the skin, stirring up old memories, making one feel both sore and awake. Mary sat next to Mrs. Crane, a woman about her mother's age, with wrinkled skin and eyes as gentle as the earth. The wagon rocked slowly down the path leading into the center of town. "It's been a long time since you've been out," Mrs. Crane said, tightening her grip on the reins. "The air's dry here, but at least there's someone to say hello to." Mary smiled slightly. "Yes, I think it's time to see more of what scares me." The carriage stopped in front of Mrs. Crane's little dress shop. When Mary got out, she saw a familiar figure at the end of the street, by the old fence of the widow Edith Moore's house. Jonas. He was down on one knee, hammering back the rotten wood. Sweat was soaking the back of his shirt. Dust was sticking to his hair, but his gaze was focused and calm, as if that mattered more than anything else. No one stood by, no one helped. Mrs. Moore, a thin woman with prematurely gray hair, sat in the shade of the porch, a cup of tea in her hand. She looked at him, her eyes filled with the quiet gratitude of someone accustomed to living with loss. Mary stopped and stared. "How long has he been doing this?" she asked Mrs. Crane. "All week," she replied, still watching Jonas. "Nobody asked him. Nobody paid him. When I asked him, he just said, 'She has no one else.'" Mary said nothing. Something moved inside her, not a sudden emotion, but a slow, warm realization, like sunshine melting into the heart. She realized that Jonas was not good only when someone saw him. He was good because he knew no other way to be. As they left town, Mary remained silent. On the way back, Mrs. Crane whistled softly, an old tune from the Civil War. The wind blew through the willows, carrying with it the smell of dried flowers and road dust. Mary looked out at the rolling hills, suddenly small and comforted. "What do you think?" Mrs. Crane asked. Mary smiled, her voice so soft that the wind almost carried it away. "I think perhaps I have seen something rare, someone who does good without anyone seeing it." Mrs. Crane nodded, her eyes sparkling. Kindness is a hard seed to grow in this land, but when it does grow, it is very strong. My dear. That evening, when Mary got home, she opened the small notebook on the table. The old paper, the familiar smell of ink, and the yellow light on the paper soothed her. She wrote in round, even handwriting. "Today, I saw you helping a person who had no relatives left. No one paid me, no one praised me. I think, perhaps for the first time in my life, I believe that true kindness still exists, and perhaps I also deserve to be treated with such kindness." She paused, added a small period at the end of the sentence, and smiled slightly. The feeling, as light as a breeze, but so real that it made her feel alive again. The next day, as the sun rose, Jonas carried a bag of seeds into the yard. He found Mary watering the white chrysanthemums on the porch flowers he had planted the week before. Now, pale yellow from the sun, she turned and smiled, a thin, misty smile. "They're almost all out," she said. "Yeah," he said, still looking at the ground. Maybe they like this spot, or maybe the person who planted them, she said, half joking, half serious. Jonas looked at her, his gaze softening. I'm not sure. Sometimes flowers just need someone not to step on them. She was silent. Maybe that was what she had needed all her life. In the afternoon, Mary brought some freshly baked cornbread to the stable. Jonas was shaving his gray horse. She set the plate on the wooden steps and whispered, "For you, I thought you needed something better than cold coffee." He turned and smiled. "I thought you never went to the stable. Maybe I'm less scared." Jonas nodded. "Thank you." She took a step back, about to turn away, but then stopped. "Jonas, what you don't have to be so nice to people." He wiped his hands and looked away. "I don't do it to make them think I'm nice. Mary, I do it because I know, if I stop, I'll become the person I was afraid of." The words left her momentarily stunned. She understood. Not everyone was born gentle. Sometimes kindness was a fight to remain human. That evening, Mary sat down and continued writing. There are people who don't need to be seen to do good things. You're one of them, and I'm learning to believe. The oil lamp flickered. She closed the book and placed it by the window, where the moonlight fell softly like a prayer. Jonas passed by on the porch, paused for a moment, and looked into the light. He saw her silhouette sitting at the table, her head bowed, her hair flowing. It was a peaceful image that calmed his heart. The night wind carried the scent of chrysanthemums, the scent of earth, and the rare tranquility of wounded souls. In that silence, between two people who were not good at speaking, something was growing, slowly but surely. Mary closed her eyes. She no longer wrote, no longer hid. She just let her heart be at peace for the first time in years. But sometimes it's the budding trust that's most vulnerable. One morning, Jonas finds Mary's notebook on the chair. The words inside make him speechless. "I married you to get away from where I was, not because I needed you." That morning, the wind blew from the southern hills, carrying the smell of dry grass and red dust. Jonas was tidying up the living room. He gathered up some old newspapers, then decided to take the wooden chair out onto the porch to fix its wobbly legs. When he lifted the woolen blanket from the chair, he saw a small brown leather-bound notebook lying there, the one Mary wrote in every night before bed. He didn't mean to read it, but as he set it down, the book opened slightly in the wind. A line in black ink appeared clearly in the middle of the page. "I married you just to leave the old place, not because I need you." Jonas stood still, his heart clenched. All the sounds in the house died down, leaving only the sound of the wind coming through the cracks in the door, filtering into the heavy silence. He closed the book, but the words did not close with him. They remained strained in his mind, more painful than any stitched wound. He took a chair out onto the porch and sat down, not smoking or looking anywhere. The coffee on the table was cold. He just sat there, looking out at the foot of the hill where Mary used to go every afternoon to pick white daisies. She married him just because she needed a way out, not because of love, not because of trust, but because she wanted to escape somewhere else. All the things he had believed in, seen in her eyes, were they all just his own imagination? Jonas was not angry, not resentful, just empty. The silence was like the sky before a storm, heavy, hazy, yet still. When Mary returned from the well, she found him still sitting there, motionless. "Jonas." He did not turn around. "Are you okay?" "Yes," he replied, his voice strangely calm. "Everything is fine." She paused, hearing something closing in his voice, like a door being closed gently but tightly. That evening, the meal was quiet. Not the comfortable silence of the previous days, but a sharp, pointed silence. One that made it easy to cut yourself when you tried to say something. Mary looked at him, his broad shoulders, his rough hand holding the spoon as if it were the only thing keeping him from collapsing. She saw darkness in his eyes, the kind she knew so well betrayed, and then she understood. He had read it. Night fell. Jonas was still sitting on the porch, looking out at the distant prairie where the moonlight spread over the fields like a silver blanket. Mary stood in the room, her hands shaking as she held the remaining notebook. She opened a new blank page and wrote more, each word shaking and wet. "I married you to leave the old place, but here I found something I never knew. A person who doesn't need to say he loves me to make me feel alive again. I'm afraid that one day you'll stop waiting for me to open my heart." She closed the book, tears dripping onto the leather cover. Then she set it on the kitchen table, where the moonlight would shine brightest, where he would see it first thing in the morning. That night, the wind blew hard. Rain came suddenly. Thunder echoed in the distance from the Sandorian mountains. Jonas had not yet come in. He had not slept. Mary sat in her room, listening to the wind pounding against the wooden roof, each sound like a remorseful heartbeat. She wanted to go out to the porch, wanted to say sorry, but she was afraid that her words would be more awkward than her silence, afraid that he would look at her with strange eyes. So she just stood there, behind the closed door, looking out at his shadow blending into the rain. Early in the morning, as the rooster crowed, Jonas entered the kitchen. He was about to light the fire when he saw the notebook lying neatly on the table. The leather cover was wet from the rain, but the middle page was dry. He opened it. The words were so shaky and real that it made his throat constrict. "I'm afraid that you'll stop waiting for me." Jonas closed his eyes. There was no anger, only pity, not for himself, but for her. She was afraid, and he, by his silence, made that fear grow. He closed the book and gently put it back. Then he went outside and stood watching the dawn. The first light was rising from the east, warming the valley. A new day was beginning. Quietly, but as if it were opening up an opportunity to make up for things left unsaid. When Mary woke up, she found Jonas already in the fields. She didn't know if he had read it, but she knew it. He knew. She made coffee and brought it out onto the porch. Setting the cup down, she said softly, "Here's your morning coffee." Jonas stood a few steps away, turned, and nodded slightly. She waited for him to say something, but all he said was, "Thank you." His voice was low, but no longer cold, just calm. And in that calm, Mary heard something deeper than forgiveness. Patience. That evening, she sat down and wrote more in her notebook, not for him to read, but for herself to understand. You can't apologize with tears. You can only prove it by staying and loving in the little things every day. She looked out onto the porch. Jonas was still repairing the barn roof, hunched over, silent in the twilight. She knew there was no need to say more. Between them, there was a broken bridge, but the wood was still there, and perhaps, if they joined hands, it could be rebuilt, no words needed. In the days that followed, they spoke less, but understood each other more. Mary still made Jonas coffee every morning, set the table, worked as usual, one afternoon when he walked into the kitchen. Their eyes met no apology, no blame, just quiet understanding. The bridge between them was rebuilt with actions smaller than words. Mornings in the Sandorian Valley began with a soft, milky light streaming through the wooden windows onto the pine kitchen counter. Mary stood watching the steam rising from the coffee pot, her hands shaking as she poured the first cup of the day. The smell wafted through the air, strong, warm, reminiscent of peaceful mornings before her own words had shattered her heart. Jonas entered. He was as composed as ever. His rough-hewn shirt frayed, old patches on the shoulders. He said nothing, just nodded as she set her coffee cup down on the table. She smiled, a thin, reserved smile. They were both silent. But in that silence, something had changed, no longer a cold distance, but a vague understanding, as gentle as light through a cloud. Jonas took a sip, his eyes studying her. "Still tastes right," he said. Mary nodded. "I remember you liked less sugar." He smiled a smile so thin it was just a curve of his lips, but it was enough to make her feel warm in her chest. They didn't talk about the book again in the days that followed. They both knew that if they dug up some things, they would break the newly green soil. Instead, they worked together quietly a little each day, each in a corner. Mary mended his shirt, the stitches neat and patient. Jonas built new fences, occasionally letting her bring water, and when she put down the bucket, they just looked at each other, not needing to speak. She began to notice the little things he still did for her, the old wooden chair fixed so it no longer wobbled. The new curtain hung at the window where she often read, or the bunch of wild grapes he picked and left on the table without a word. Each one was like a small nail, bit by bit, nailing down the bridge between two souls that had once been broken. Late in the afternoon, Mary went out into the garden. The wind blew the scent of hay, mixed with the chirping of insects and, in the distance, the hammering of a horse from the stable. She watched Jonas's silhouette crouched in the sunset, huge and quiet, as if he belonged to the earth, to the wind, to the unhurried seasons. She suddenly realized that she had stopped counting the days. Time was no longer something to endure, but to live. At night, when he entered the kitchen, the smell of freshly baked cornbread filled the house. She poured him a cup of warm milk, set it on the table, and sat down across from him. They ate in silence, the only sound being the crackling of the fire in the hearth. "Do you think people can start over?" she asked, her voice low. Jonas looked up. Start over, after hurting someone. He looked at her for a long moment, then said slowly, "I think, if people are still here, still trying to do the right thing, they've started over. None of us are completely clean, but patience is how we clean ourselves." Mary was silent. She thanked him, not with words but with a wet look. She understood. He had forgiven, and that made her want to live a kinder life, more worthy of his kindness. One morning, Jonas went to town to buy nails and wire. On the way back, he stopped his horse on the hillside. Below, their small farm was nestled in the vast yellow grass, the smoke from their stoves rising thinly like threads. He remembered the first time he brought her here. She was quiet, trembling, her eyes misty. Now, in that house, there was the sound of men sawing wood, women singing softly while washing dishes. Sometimes, what people call love is not a wave, but just a small stream that flows forever. When he returned, Mary was hanging her clothes out on the porch. She saw him and smiled. "You're back early. The horse was going faster than I thought. Or maybe you're homesick." Jonas stopped and looked at her, half joking, half serious. Maybe so. Mary laughed, the first laugh he had heard from her since arriving. It was soft, clear, like the clinking of glasses, and he realized it was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard in his life. In the evening, Jonas added more logs to the fire. The firelight fell on Mary's face, highlighting the bright lines in her eyes. She stopped avoiding him. She looked at him, longer, deeper. There was peace in that look, not because they had forgotten the past, but because they had learned to live with it. He sat down beside her and poured 2 cups of tea. She took them, her hand lightly touching his. Neither of them flinched. They just sat there, silent, listening to the wind outside, the fire, and each other's breathing. It is not reconciliation with words, but with presence the simplest language of compassion. That night, Mary wrote in her diary, "A bridge doesn't need to be built with wood. It just needs to be built with people's hearts. You don't blame me. I don't apologize. Between us, silence has turned into trust." She put down her pen, closed her notebook, and looked out the window where the moonlight bathed the courtyard. Outside, Jonas was walking around the stables, a lantern in his hand. The lantern cast a golden light on the path leading to the house, like a string connecting them in the darkness. But sometimes, just when faith is at its best, trials come unexpectedly. One windy afternoon, the smell of smoke rises from the meadow. The fire begins to spread, and in the midst of that sea of flames, Mary will have to choose run, or believe that the safest place is the man who waited for her in silence. There was a strange smell in the air that afternoon. The wind blew from the west harder than usual, carrying the dry scent of cracked earth and a faint, threatening smell of burning. Mary was hanging clothes out on the porch when she saw a thin line of smoke rising from the distant hillside. At first, she thought it was someone burning hay, but a moment later the sky in that direction darkened black and red as blood. "Jonas," she called out. He ran from the stables, his eyes narrowed toward the smoke. With another breath of wind, they knew the whole valley could be ablaze. "The winds shifted," he said quickly. "We must get the horses out." Mary nodded, her heart pounding. She helped him open the stable gate and let the horses out of the wooden stalls one by one. But the dry wind brought the fire closer than they could have imagined. The crackling of burning grass, the howling of the wind, and the swirling of red dust, as if the earth were angry. "Go!" Mary Jonas shouted, his voice hoarse from the smoke. "And you, I'll save the last ones." He dashed back into the barn, where the flames had reached the roof. Mary stood still. Smoke swirled around her, stinging her eyes, choking her. She looked back at the house, at the small table and the leather-bound notebook he kept with him. The notebook, she knew, contained all of Jonas's notes, the things he had never said, about his father, about the war, and about her. Without thinking, she ran into the house. Smoke filled the kitchen. The darkness and the red glow of the fire blended together, making everything seem dreamy. She covered her mouth, bent low, and rummaged through the drawers. When her hand touched the worn leather cover, she collapsed, coughing. The heat burned her throat, and her eyes watered. Outside, Jonas shouted her name. His voice was drowned by the wind and fire. "Mary, answer me." She clutched the book tightly and rushed to the door. The fire licked at the hem of her skirt. The wind stung her skin. She ran, out of breath. Her foot tripped on the step, and she fell face down on the ground. Strong arms pulled her up. Jonas. He held her tightly, his voice a mixture of anger and worry. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Mary gasped, coughing and speaking intermittently. "I can't let it burn." "What?" She held out the book, its cover scorched, her voice broken. "It's you. All the things you never said. I can't let it disappear." Jonas froze. In that moment, amid the smoke and flames, time seemed to stand still. He looked at her, her hair disheveled, her face streaked with ash, her eyes still burning. He wanted to scold, to scream, but all he could say was a hoarse, choked sentence. "Mary, you're crazy." She laughed through her tears, "I know, but if I went crazy because I wanted to keep a part of you, then I don't regret it." He pulled her toward the well, where there was still some water in the large tub. They poured water over themselves, trying to wash away the ashes. They both sank to the ground, panting, watching the flames engulf the stable in the distance. Mary shivered, resting her head on his shoulder. He put his hand on her hair, his hand still warm and rough as ever. After a moment, she spoke softly, as if afraid the wind would hear Jonas. "What I came here to hide, but I stayed for you." He looked down, her eyes reflecting the flickering firelight, both frightened and determined. She continued, her voice breaking, "You are the only place I have ever felt safe." Jonas squeezed her hand, saying nothing. Through the acrid smoke, he bowed his head and touched his forehead to hers, a gesture both awkward and profound, like an unspoken promise. That night, the fire finally died down. The farmhouse was nothing but charred logs, the smell of smoke lingering in the air. Jonas and Mary sat together on the blackened ground. They didn't speak of what was lost, they just held hands, because they knew that what mattered most was that they were alive, and they had each other. In her hand, the notebook he still held scorched and blackened at the edges, but the middle page intact. Jonas opened it, looking at the words he had written long ago. "If someday I find peace, perhaps it will come in the shape of silence and eyes that believe." He chuckled, then handed the notebook to her. "You keep it. It was probably yours all along." She shook her head. "No, it was yours. I just want you to remember. Someone wants to keep all of you." The next morning, as the sun rose, thin smoke still hung over the ash. Jonas stood up and held out his hand to help her up. They looked around. Where the roof had once been, there was only ash and the black shadow of memories. But amid the rubble, two people still stood side by side, hand in hand. Mary whispered, her voice hoarse from the smoke, "Shall we do it again?" Jonas nodded. "Of course, as long as there is earth, as long as there is sky, there is a chance." She smiled, her tears mingling with the sunlight. She knew that from the ashes something else had been born, not a house, but love. As the night passed, the ashes cooled, and the first post-fire sun shone down on the valley. Mary and Jonas sat on the burned porch, sharing a blanket, holding hands. There was no distance, no fear, just two people who had been alone. Now, learning to breathe together again in the dawn after the ashes, that morning, no one spoke a word. They just sat there, in the sea of smoke, on the ground black as burnt velvet. The wooden frames that had once been the roof still glowed red. like fragments of memories that had not yet fallen asleep. Mary pulled the wool blanket over Jonas's shoulders. He was silent, watching the thin wisp of smoke drift into the sky. The first light shone through the gap where the window had been a weak but stubborn light, as if to say that life would go on, no matter how lost. Mary said softly, "Do you find it too quiet?" Jonas nodded slightly. Silence isn't scary. It's scary when you have no one to be silent with. The simple sentence made her throat tighten. They sat all morning, watching the sun rise over the hilltops, sending down wispy columns of smoke. The farm was reduced to ash, but strangely, there was no panic in their hearts. Perhaps seeing everything burn and still living taught one to be at peace with loss. Mary reached out and took Jonas's hand. For the first time, she held his hand not out of fear, not out of need, but simply because she wanted to feel the warmth of someone still there. Jonas squeezed his hand was calloused, rough, but with the enduring warmth of the earth, of someone who had endured more than could be told. By noon, they began to clean up what was left. Jonas raked the ashes with a hoe, looking for anything that could be saved. She followed, picking up shards of pottery, half-burned spoons. They didn't speak, but there was a strange peace in the silence, as if the very act of picking up the pieces together was a promise that they would start again, even with their bare hands. In the corner of the garden, Mary spotted a small green shoot emerging from the ashes. She bent down, marveling at the delicate sprout, a miracle of the earth, a wordless message that everything could come back to life. She called Jonas over and pointed. He looked, then smiled slightly. "This earth is good. Grass will grow again. Flowers will grow again." Mary looked up, her eyes sparkling. "People too." "Right." Jonas nodded. "People too." Evening fell. They made a small shelter out of old tarps. Mary started a fire and made soup, a simple soup of leftover grain. The smell of smoke mingled with the smell of damp earth, but when she handed the bowl to Jonas, he whispered, "I don't remember the last time I ate anything this good." Mary laughed. "It's nothing but beans and hope. That's enough." They ate in the fading twilight. The sky, the red of last night's fires, had turned to a soft orange. A day had passed since it all fell apart, and somehow they were still sitting here, no longer afraid, no longer lost. At night, they sat leaning against each other in front of the cold ashes, listening to the crickets chirping somewhere in the darkness. Mary said softly, "I used to think that everything could only begin when you left the past. But it turns out that to be reborn, one must learn to stand up from one's own ashes." Jonas looked at her. In the moonlight, her face was no longer the face of someone who was afraid when she first came to Red Hollow, but of someone who had weathered the storm. He replied softly, "Maybe this world is rebuilt every day, with just that little faith." They sat like that, not sleeping, watching the sky lighten through the pale smoke. That night, neither of them cried, but in that silence, both of their tears had long since dried, giving way to something warmer trust. The next morning, as the sun streamed over the hill, Mary took a bucket to the well. She looked at her reflection in the water, her hair ashen, her dress torn, her face dirty, but in the reflection of her eyes, she saw light. Jonas came forward, carrying his old scorched hat. "We'll need new wood," he said, "and time, yes, but we have both." She smiled. "Jonas," she said softly, her voice shaking but no longer afraid. "Thank you for not leaving." He looked at her for a long time, then replied simply, "It wasn't me who stayed. It was you who made me not want to leave." That night, as the wind blew through the valley, carrying the first scent of fresh grass since the fire, Mary wrote in her scorched-edge notebook, "We lost everything, but in the darkest night I see more clearly the light of a lamp in the shape of kindness and love. Ashes are not just residue, they are new soil where beautiful things can grow." She put down her pen and looked away. Jonas was lying nearby, resting, his arm across his forehead, his face relaxed for the first time in months. She smiled slightly. This dawn, no roof, no more, but the two of them was still the first dawn of a new life. Time passed, the grass grew again, the earth healed, the weather warmed. Spring returned to Red Hollow, not only in the land, but in the hearts of the people. Mary planted white daisies in the burned garden, and Jonas, after years of living only to survive, began to live to love. A spring breeze blew gently through the Sandorian Valley. The scents of fresh earth, rain, and fresh grass mingled in the air, a scent that only comes after harsh days. Mary knelt beside the small bed of soil in front of the porch, her hands covered in mud, her hair slightly tangled in the wind. Where the black earth had once been, after the fire, now sprouted white chrysanthemums, young and stubborn. Each cut, each seed sown was a silent prayer for the land to be revived, for people's hearts to be at peace. In the distance, Jonas was rebuilding the east fence, the familiar figure, tall, silent. The sunlight across his shoulders made Mary feel suddenly at peace, as if the world had been set right again. She looked at him for a long moment. Jonas, sensing her gaze, turned and smiled softly, a smile that no longer had the forced, shy quality it had at first. "White daisies?" he asked, his voice low but warm. "Yes, my mother's favorite," she replied, brushing her hands off her apron. "They say they only grow in good soil." He looked around the small garden, where new grass had begun to cover the old burn. So the land has been forgiven. That statement made her pause. She understood. He was not just talking about land. That afternoon, they worked on the well. Jonas pulled the bucket, and Mary sat beside him, washing each crockery found in the ashes. The water was cool and clear, reflecting the sunlight. "Are you still going to Red Hollow?" she asked. "Maybe in a few days," he said. "I have to buy more nails and some wood. You want to come too?" Mary thought about it, then shook her head. "No, I want to stay. These flower beds need someone to look after." Jonas smiled. "Okay, but make sure you lock the door." She smiled back. "Have you forgotten? There's only wind and rabbits here. The only thing I've ever been afraid of is myself." Jonas paused, his gaze lingering on her so long that she had to duck to avoid it. But deep down, she knew it was the look of a man who believed that the most fragile things in life could last. The days that followed passed with a strange calm. Mary rose early each morning and made coffee, setting it on the wooden table before Jonas left for the stables. At noon, they ate together, sometimes hard bread and bean soup, sometimes just baked potatoes, but the meal, simple as it was filled with something they had both been missing for so long, presence. Some afternoons they said nothing. Jonas chiseled wood on the porch. Mary mended clothes by the window, the sound of a knife on wood, the sound of a needle sewing softly through cloth. The sounds were small, steady as the new life they were rebuilding from the ashes, One evening, as the wind carried the scent of wildflowers into the house, Mary opened the old notebook, the one that had nearly burned, the one that had made her cry. Now she added, "We don't say we love each other. We just live together, more gently each day." And, perhaps, that's how Westerners know how to say they love each other. The first real spring came when Jonas brought home 2 young horses. A gift, he said, was to start over. She laughed at how muddy they were, and he clumsily stroked their manes. "Have you named them yet?" Jonas thought for a moment, then said, "Hope, the female, maybe Faith." Mary laughed. Hope and faith. 2 things we might have found again. He looked at her, his eyes saying yes, thanks to you. Another morning. Mary woke earlier than usual. She opened the door and stood watching the sunrise over the hills. Honey-colored light poured down the valley, gilding the young grass, somewhere in the wind. She heard a rooster crowing, the drip of well water, and the faint smell of coffee from the kitchen. Jonas was making it, as he did every morning. She walked in and saw that he was shaved, his hair combed, his shirt clean. He looked up, a little embarrassed, a rare thing for Jonas. "You're up early?" she asked. "Couldn't sleep?" he said softly. Thinking about something, Jonas smiled, his eyes trembling slightly. "Yes, about something I never told you." Before Mary could ask, he stepped out onto the porch, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand. She followed him and stood beside him. Before them, a garden of white daisies was in full bloom, each flower pure white against the warm brown earth. "You see," she said softly, "they're growing." Jonas nodded, "Just like us." In that moment, Mary felt her heart tremble, not from the cold, but from something warmer than the sunlight. She knew that spring had come not only to the earth, it had come in their eyes, in the way he looked at her, not with shyness, but with the tenderness of someone who had learned to trust again. That evening, Jonas sat on the porch, fingering a small piece of wood. Mary came out and asked, "What are you doing?" "Just trying to carve." Carve what Jonas looked up and smiled. "Something I don't know the name of." She sat down beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. The spring wind blew through the willow trees in the yard, the leaves rustling in whispers. In the pale yellow sunset, the 2 of them just sat there not speaking, not needing to speak. Because sometimes true love doesn't come from promises, but from silence that is no longer heavy. A few weeks later, under the half-burned willows, Jonas called Mary out. On his hand was a wooden ring carved from the same piece of wood from that night. He knelt down, his eyes trembling slightly as on the first day he met her, in the spring afternoon light. He spoke the words that heaven and earth had waited so long to hear. That afternoon, a thin ray of sunlight spread across the Sandorian Valley. The air was fresh and cool, carrying the smell of damp earth and the scent of white daisies on the wind. Mary was folding dry clothes when Jonas called from the yard. "Mary." His voice was low, but there was something strange about it, a rare tremor in the man of few words. She looked up and saw him standing under a willow tree that had burned half its trunk a year ago. The tree had new leaves now, small buds pushing up from the charred bark, soft as silk. Mary stepped forward, her hands still smelling of soap. "Do you need help?" Jonas shook his head. "No, just come closer." She came, her shoes half buried in the grass. He stood up straight, his hands behind his back. "This tree," he said, looking up at the young willow branches. "I thought it was dead. But look, it's growing back, even though the roots were burned. She nodded slightly. It's trying to live like a human. He smiled a warm, hesitant smile. I thought, if it can live again, maybe we can too. With that, he knelt down. Mary was stunned. In his hand was a smooth wooden ring, lightly engraved with a spiral around the edge. "Jonas," she whispered, her voice choking. "I made it from the living trunk," he said slowly, as if afraid the words would be lost in the wind. "It's not pretty, it's not expensive, but it's carved by my hand, and each cut is a word I can't say." She couldn't breathe. The last light of day filtered through the willow leaves, casting shadows on his face, making the scene like a painting, raw, simple, but containing all the things never said. "Mary," he continued, "I can't promise you an easy life, but I can promise you that whenever you're afraid, I'll stand between you and your fear. I've lived long enough to know love isn't magic, it's choosing each other, every day, through thick and thin." A tear fell on her hand. Mary laughed softly, choking back tears. "You know, Jonas, I used to think happiness was being away from everything. Now I understand. Happiness is being back to myself, in the arms of someone who doesn't force me to be someone else." Jonas was silent. She looked at him, her eyes as deep as lakes. "So, do you agree?" he asked hoarsely, still holding out the wooden ring. Mary bent down, tears wetting his cheeks. "Yes, Jonas, 1,000 times yes." He smiled, a soft smile, not brilliant but sincere to the core. He slipped the ring onto her finger. The wooden ring, rustic and warm, fit snugly on her thin finger as if it was meant to be there. They embraced under the willow tree. The spring breeze blew gently, the young branches swayed, and a few small leaves fell, like a silent blessing from nature. Mary leaned her head against his chest, listening to his heartbeat, deep, steady, even, the most familiar sound in her life. "I thought I was too late for love," she whispered. Jonas pressed his lips to her hair and whispered, "No one is late, only those who are still brave enough to begin." The afternoon was fading. They sat side by side on an old blanket spread under a willow tree, watching the sun set behind the red mountains. No music, no flowery words, just the two of them, each hurt, each afraid, now sitting side by side in the peace they had sought all their lives. She looked at the ring in her hand and said softly, "I like it because it rose from the ashes, like us." Jonas looked at it, his eyes soft. "Then it's perfect." The afternoon wind blew through their hair, carrying the smell of earth, wood, and new beginnings. Mary turned and touched his chest. "You know, Jonas, I don't need anything else, just to have each other under this sky." He took her hand and kissed the back of it slowly, carefully, as if afraid to break the silence. "We'll have many more seasons," he said, "and I want each one to start with your smile." Night fell. The first moonlight of the month stretched across the valley. The willow tree cast its shadow on the ground where the two of them sat close together, their breaths mingling with the wind. Mary leaned her head on his shoulder and whispered, "I used to dream of someone calling my name with tenderness. Turns out, I don't need to dream anymore." Jonas smiled, gently stroking her hand. "And I used to think I would die of old age alone on this land. Now I know. The land is no longer a place to die, but a place to live." From afar, the chirping of crickets mingled with the wind, creating a sound as soft as a song. They said nothing more. because sometimes love does not need words. It exists, fully, in the breath, in the look, in the hand that holds tightly. The willow tree that was once burned by fire now bears witness to life. And beneath it, two people, a mute man, a lost woman, find the answer to all suffering that to love is to dare to stay. That night, after the promise was made under the willows, Mary smiled and held out her hand to Jonas. "Dance with me," she said. He hesitated, then laughed. "But there is no music." "There is," she said. "You just have to listen." And so, in the spring breeze, they began their own dance, slow, slow, like the breath of the earth and the beating of two newly healed hearts. The night wind in the Sandorian valley was soft as a lullaby. Moonlight spread across the meadows, reflecting off the dew on the willows. In the midst of it all, Mary and Jonas stood face to face, two people who had once been strangers, now quietly finding each other not through words, but through peaceful looks. Mary held out her hand, her small hand still covered in the dust of the day. "Dance with me," she whispered. Jonas paused, smiling. "There's no music." "Yes," she said, her voice almost breathy. "Just listen." He slowly placed his hand on her back. His warmth radiated through the thin fabric, like a small spark in the cold night. They walked, not hurriedly, not in time, just hesitant but real movements, amid the sound of wind, grass, and heartbeats. The wind blew through the willow trees, creating a song without words. Each leaf trembled gently, like a distant melody. Somewhere, crickets chirped, and the ground beneath their feet was as soft as memories. No one taught them to dance, but perhaps love, when quiet enough, deep enough, knows how to lead people back to each other. Jonas looked at Mary, her hair flowing in the wind, the moonlight reflecting on her dewy skin. "I forgot what it felt like, to be in a moment and not want it to pass," he said softly. Mary leaned her head on his shoulder. "I used to think I didn't deserve happiness anymore, but maybe happiness isn't a reward. It's just the moment you open your heart." Jonas chuckled. "Then tonight, let's keep the moment." They circled slowly, step by step, in the dewy meadow. No spectators, no music, no promise of tomorrow, just the moonlight filtering through the willow leaves, and two people hurt by the past finding hope in each other's arms. When they stopped, Mary looked up. The willow tree above them drooped, its branches forming a soft arch. "Do you hear that?" she asked. Jonas listened. The wind. She shook her head, smiling. "No, it's the earth breathing." He didn't understand everything, but he believed in the way she spoke, the way she saw everything, even the pain as part of something better to come. They sat down, side by side, under the shade of the willows. The night wind blew, carrying the scent of white chrysanthemums from the garden into the air. Mary rested her head on his shoulder, her voice as soft as a prayer. "If someone asked me what love is, I think I would say when someone chooses to stay, even when they could leave." Jonas nodded slightly. "And you would say when you find someone who makes silence full." They were silent for a long time, but it was the kind of silence that warmed the heart, the silence of peace, of two hearts that no longer had to hide. Somewhere an owl hooted. The sun had set, and the night sky was strewn with stars. Jonas looked up and said softly, "I thought someone like me would die in battle, never having the chance to tell anyone I loved." Mary took his hand. "Now you have." He looked at her. Under the starlight, her eyes were soft and bright, no longer the trembling gaze of the letter bride. In those eyes now was the earth, the sky, and the light that only exists when one has gone through the darkness without losing faith. They sat together until the moon sank behind the hills. Dew was gathering on their shoulders, but neither of them bothered to get up. Jonas chuckled. "We'll have to redo the east fence tomorrow." Mary laughed too. "Yes, and I'll plant some more chrysanthemums. I don't think I'm going anywhere. No, I'm already where I need to be." He squeezed her hand, his calloused hand intertwined with her small, slender one, fitting, steady like an unspoken oath. The wind blew through the meadow, and the willows rustled. The moon was fading, giving way to the first light of dawn. Mary looked up slightly. "Jonas," she said softly, "if anyone asked me if it was possible to love again after being broken—" Jonas interrupted her with a smile. "I would say yes, because love, like earth, needs rain and faith to grow again." They stood up again, still holding hands, and spun around once more in the lighted meadow. It was no longer the dance of two lost souls, but the dance of those who had found their way home. No music, no audience, only soft laughter echoed across the vast sky and earth, dissolving into the wind like a thank you to life. That morning, as the sun rose, someone passing through Red Hollow might have seen two small figures in the field jumping, laughing, alive, a dance without music, but enough to tell their whole story that in the driest places, love still grows, that scars remind not only of pain, but also of survival, and that sometimes the most beautiful thing in life is not starting, but daring to start again. Years later, it was said that every spring wind blew through the Sandorian Valley. The willows of Red Hollow whispered. Some said it was the sound of love that never died. Some said it was just the wind. But to those who had stood there, they knew it was the music of two hearts learning to love again, in a land as harsh and gentle as its people. The mail-order bride arrived with fear in her eyes. Is more than just a story about a mail-order bride and a quiet cowboy. It's a story about trust being rebuilt from broken pieces, about how sometimes kindness doesn't need fancy words. It just needs people to stay, even when everything is burned to the ground. Mary and Jonas found each other not in passion or promises, but in the gentleness of every small action, a cup of water left by the door, a flower replanted in scorched earth, a musicless dance under the moon. Love doesn't need to be great. It just needs to be sincere enough to make two people hurt and still want to open their hearts again. And, perhaps, that is also what each of us needs to remember, that even when life scares us, we can still choose to believe, because believing is the bravest form of the heart. That, in a noisy world, what heals us the most, sometimes is just someone choosing to stay in silence. Thank you for joining Frontier Hearts, where we not only hear about old love stories, but also find a little hope for the present. If this story touches you, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel to continue riding with us the journeys of kindness, faith, and loving hearts, though late, but still beautiful like a dawn after a storm.